Welcome to the Tucson Bitcoin podcast. Today my guest is Bill Bergman, who is joining me for a second time. I had him on a while ago, and we had a great conversation about monetary theory and government spending and borrowing, and this is kind of a continuation of the conversation. So if you didn't have the chance to listen to the first one, go back and check it out. And also check out the conversation I had with Sheila Weinberg. She is the founder of the organization that Bill works for, called Truth in Accounting, and they are incredible. They go and audit the government financial statements and make them readable and show you how scary the situation is. There's very few states that are have a surplus. Wyoming being one of them, where our Bitcoin Senator Kelly Lummis is from, where she used to manage the budget. So that's a good positive. We have somebody that knows what they're doing in Congress for once. But yeah, it was a fun conversation. Bill is the head of research over at Truth in Accounting. He's also a professor at Loyola University, and he used to work for the Chicago Fed. So he knows his stuff, and it was really fun just bouncing back and forth, talking about economics and monetary theory and all the fun, scary stuff that is so important for normal people to understand, because these are the issues that really impact our lives. The way that government recklessly spends our money or deficit spends, that stuff impacts us in the long run. It creates inflation. It means that they can't honor their obligations and promises. You know, if you're expecting a pension in Arizona, go and look at their pension database on Truth in Accounting, and you'll see that it's not guaranteed that you'll get it. It looks just as bad as Social Security. It's a giant Ponzi scheme, and it's falling apart. And that's why Bitcoin is so important right now. But yeah, I hope you enjoy this conversation. I really did. It was a lot of fun. Always enjoy talking to Bill. And yeah. Alrighty, we're recording. Good to have you on, Bill.
Great, Alex. Nice to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Sure. You're my first repeat guest, so congratulations.
Well, thank you. I can't wait. This will be here we go.
Yeah, no, I think the work that Truth in Accounting is doing is incredibly important, because people are so unaware of how broke our government is and really need to see it in reality. They see the official numbers, which look pretty terrible a lot of times, but they don't know the accounting wizardry that goes behind the scenes. So yeah.
Well, that's our goal in Truth in Accounting, is to help citizens understand the true state of affairs. Having said that, it's hard to know what the true state of affairs is in the world of finance and government finance in particular, for a few reasons. But we've got to try, as citizens and taxpayers. We all have a duty to our own wallets to watch after them, and that's what we're trying to help people do with Truth in Accounting.
Yeah, kind of going off of, it's hard to tell. Well, the official CPI was, I think, somewhere around 1.4% for 2020, and the Fed is discontinuing the M2, or at least they're changing the way that they report it. So they like to manipulate the numbers to hide.
It was interesting that you referred to the quote official CPI. Does that reflect any skepticism in your eyes of the accounting for inflation in the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I talk to normal people about inflation, I like to ask them how much more expensive things have gotten over the years, and like if it's noticeable, and like they generally say they're targeting around 2% or having trouble meeting that 2%, but that doesn't reflect increases in just about everything that matters, like childcare, housing, education, all of these things that actually, people are paying for, that should be included in the CPI, that are on like parabolic upswings rather than a steady increase of 2% yearly. And so what it comes down to, there's a guy named Ed Butowski. I like him a lot. He unfortunately wasn't able to get a 2020 um, report done, but he also does his own inflation calculator called the Chapwood Index, and so he has people over the country that um, goes and reports on the average cost of like some of the most commonly used or bought items, and so
There's an
they'll
effort at AIER, American Institute for Economic Research, kind of like that. They have an everyday price index as
mhm.
another way to try to measure. And once you look under the hood and how all of these things are put together, you realize that it's not an easy task. There's a lot of uncertainty about what we know and don't know about how to measure inflation. Some of those issues underneath, including measuring quality improvement or lack thereof. And anyway, when you look under the hood, it's not an easy thing to understand. Having said that, I share your concern that it's possible that our real inflation may not be what we're being told.
Yeah, I think one of the tricky things about inflation too is it's not always reflected in the prices of things. So, like, automobiles, for example, they're increasing in cost, but they're not really getting better other than like some few superficial differences, like the gas mileage and performance stays the same over time, but the quality doesn't improve. And
From a longer term perspective, I gotta disagree a little bit, but this is going to open the door to thinking about this in a way that I think supports your position. In 1960, what do you think the median price of a four-door sedan was about roughly? Just take a guess. You don't have to get it right.
$4,000.
About $1,800. I actually,
Oh,
back when I worked at the Federal Reserve, they had this wonderful automotive industry publication called Ward's Automotive Reports. And I looked back at the 1960 yearbook, and they had a ranking of all the four-door sedans, and the median price at that time was $1,800. Today it's north of 25,000. That increase from 1,800 to whatever it is today, last I looked anyway, is about 3 times as big as the increase in the CPI for new cars.
hmm.
Now, we have better cars today, but how do you measure? And that's when you get into the theoretical and almost philosophical issues in the CPI, and that's the difficulties with quantifying quality. How do you, when quality is in the view of the beholder, how do you actually quantify the improvement in the quality of goods and services? And that's when you get into a world of ambiguity and possible scope for manipulation.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I the thing that amazes me about an inflationary economy is like technology is inherently deflationary. Like it should be getting more efficient over time because like if you look at the 1960s and the way that cars were made, it was far less efficient. They didn't have robots making a lot of the pieces, and they didn't have cheaper outsourcing. Supply chains weren't as efficient, and if we had a money that was stable, I would imagine that the car prices would either remain stable or actually decrease in cost over time.
Well,
So,
that raises immediately a very interesting question from the point of view of what Congress has told the Federal Reserve to pursue in conducting monetary policy. The current mandate for the Fed to pursue quote unquote stable prices, maximum employment, and moderate long-term interest rates, that arrived in 1977 in the Federal Reserve Reform Act of 1977. Prior to that, the Federal Reserve and the rest of the federal government operated theoretically under the mandate from the Employment Act of 1946 that the government pursue maximum purchasing power or promote purchasing power, which isn't necessarily the same thing as stable prices. And what you're mentioning with respect to cars, I think, is a fascinating issue. What in a world where technology is helping us and we're getting more productive, is it possible that a slowly declining price level is what should be the case? Even so, pursuing stable prices, maybe that's not just the right goal. You should pursue maximum purchasing power. You can debate this stuff, but
yeah, Yeah, I think like from a philosophical standpoint, where I stand is that inflation disproportionately benefits asset owners, which is growing increasingly more centralized, and it benefits them at the expense of average people that do not have the same access to owning capital in the same way.
That's an interesting perspective, and I think it's not you're not getting as lonely as you used to be. I think more people are thinking along these lines, and there's more sensitivity about the distributional impacts of monetary policy these days, even at the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, I mean it I think it was Ludwig von Mises who might have been Friedrich Hayek. I can't remember, but they presented this idea that it's one thing if you are impacted by the market. If you get laid off because of market conditions, and it's another thing if you're disproportionately impacted by a decision of a central planner, um, and just the unfairness of that, of like you can point the finger at this person instead of just saying, well, life happens.
Well, let's step back and think about that congressional mandate for the Federal Reserve. We have Congress, in its infinite wisdom, has directed effectively 12 people voting on the FOMC to try to manage the total amount of money and credit of more than 300 million other people. We have 12 people attempting to do this. Let's assume that they're honest. Can they even do this? And with a view to pursuing the goals that Congress gave them: stable prices, maximum employment, and moderate. Or, at the end of the day, are we asking them to do too much? And I think in 2008, 2009, we learned our lesson that we should have learned, that maybe these folks don't have as much farsighted, predictive, and or analytical capacity to do something that's that complicated.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty much Hayek's entire thesis in The Road to Serfdom. Um, it's it's kind of ludicrous to imagine that 12 people can try and um, be the overlords over millions of people interacting in a decentralized manner. For sure, it's
In their defense, you might argue that, granted, if we didn't have the Fed, we would have something that might be even worse. Maybe it's a hard thing. It's a hard task we've asked the Federal Reserve to pursue, but without it, would we be worse off?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, free market money, I think, is a really interesting concept, and we do have precedents for it. And so when uh, gold was the standard, gold isn't the greatest money in the world because it's not very portable or divisible, and that's why we moved on to fiat money. But when you have free market money, I think it allows for better circumstances and fairness in the markets for sure. Um, I think like the the boom bust cycles are actually exasperated a lot by the Federal Reserve, like we're seeing right now, because we're just standing on a house of cards waiting for it to eventually, like nobody, I think very few people think that the system we're in right now is sustainable. And I think we've enjoyed a lot of um, stability and progress over the
that
past.
that that, that we can't take for granted.
Mm.
Among other people questioning that sustainability, you might be surprised to learn that the federal government itself, in the financial report of the US government, has a discussion of the sustainability of the federal government's finances in its annual financial report. And here's just by way of background: in a world, the financial report of the US government is one of the most complicated things on the face of the earth when you start trying to figure it out. But you can do simple things sometimes when faced with challenging analytical challenges like that. By way of background, let's go back to the boom before the bust in 2008, 2009. AIG had a very complicated set of financial statements. But if you had looked, and I did, before the boom busted, I just counted the number of times the phrase credit default swap appeared in their 10K every year in the years up to 2000, 2008, 2009. In 2003, it was in there once. 2004, it was in there twice. 2005 was in there 3 times and 3 times again. But then in 2007, the 2007 10K for AIG, when it came out in early '08, before the meltdown, it was in there more than 100 times. All of a sudden, poof, the lawyers were scared. Well, this is an example of the kind of thing, a simple thing you can do, and I do it with the financial report of the U.S. government. Rhetoric analysis can be maybe too easy to do, but it's actually, if you do a word count on the word unsustainable in the financial report of the U.S. government, you see a steady march upward from 1 to 16 over the last 10 years. There's increasing discussion reflecting increasing concern about the sustainability of our federal government's finances. And here we are in current weeks about to see a test case of that sustainability and how much we can actually blow through the ceiling that we've already tried to blow through in the last decade.
So do you think that we're in the danger zone in the next few weeks then?
I don't see anything imminent, but that's not. I'm not a predictor. I'm not a I don't. We have enough trouble figuring out what happened last month in the economy or in financial markets. I try to be careful, and I teach my students the importance of humility. Having said that, it's an important thing to watch. And one of the things that we do learn from history is to be respectful of the fact that the kind of moment that you're suggesting might be at hand, it isn't there until it is. And crowd psychology can turn very quickly. And if the attitude towards U.S. Treasuries changes quickly, well, that can happen in financial markets. We learned it in 2008, 2009, and it's something to monitor and watch and be careful of.
Yeah, for sure. It's one of the things that I like about Truth in Accounting. So you guys go to great lengths to go and audit the financial reports and bring together kind of a comprehensive report that gets through the accounting wizardry that our government likes to do.
Those annual reports are very dense and very complicated. And it's hard for the average Joe and Jane to actually have a chance of even opening them. That's why they don't. It's almost they're rationally choosing not to read them for a reason. It's not that they're being irresponsible. It's just that it's so hard. And that's what we're trying to do, is to dig through all those things, put it into a coherent and reliable format that's relatively simple and understandable. That's our goal with the financial state of the cities, financial state of the states, and the financial state of the union, which we're going to be, we should have in the next few weeks, if not maybe a month or so, the annual financial report of the U.S. government for the last fiscal year, and we'll be digging into that as soon as it comes out.
Yeah, I think that one will be pretty wild, looking at what's happened over the past year. So yeah, let's talk about what's going on in Chicago right now. Last time I had Sheila on and had you on, it looked pretty grim. Where does the city stand at right now?
Well, it's still pretty grim. Again, we have to respect the fact that we don't have a financial report for 2020 yet. The city of Chicago by law is directed to produce an annual financial report within 6 months of the end of its fiscal year. But if recent years are any indication, the city of Chicago will go ahead and issue it after 6 months are over, and then put a date on a letter of transmittal that's June 30th to make it look like it came out with 6 months. So the first thing I got to say is, we're flying while blind in a sense. We only have information for the fiscal year 2019 for the city of Chicago. We're still waiting. That's a lesson from the city of Chicago for everyone, that the timeliness of financial reporting, especially the audited financial reports that come at the end of the fiscal year, they're very important documents. But unfortunately, and one of the reasons why the city of Chicago is in desperate financial conditions these days, is that we've had a long-term focus on the budgets. And the budgets are prospective, forward-looking documents that are malleable in terms of their accounting, and in fact deceptive. The city of Chicago, besides claiming to produce its annual financial report every 6 months, within 6 months of the fiscal year, they also say that they produce a balanced budget every year according to state law. And that may be true, strictly speaking, based on what the law says, but they can do things like borrowing money to plug in the gap and to not fund pensions and retiree healthcare programs. They're basically based on a cash basis type budgeting and accounting system that allows for the accumulation of debt, even as they tell the citizens and taxpayers that they balance the budget. And that's a fundamental issue, not just for the city of Chicago. We're among the most egregious in the nation on this score, but it's a problem everywhere, which flows from a current project that we're on at Truth in Accounting. The Governmental Accounting Standards Board in recent years has been moving towards and recently issued these two formal exposure drafts for governmental funds statements. These aren't the overall government statements. Those are actually relatively reliable in the comprehensive annual financial reports. But the underlying governmental fund statements are what the governments use for budgets. And it's those, for instance, the city of Chicago has had a positive general funds balance for the last decade, even as it's dug itself into a massive hole. You should see the interest expense numbers alone for the city of Chicago in the last 15 years. They've gone from something like $400 million a year, which is already a lot, to in its latest year, in the footnotes, there's a disclosure that the city of Chicago is incurring, before it takes a single kid to school or puts a policeman on the corner, the city of Chicago, because of all this cumulative borrowing, is incurring $1.4 billion a year in interest expense alone, from the longstanding practice of borrowing money to make itself whole. And that's that's not sustainable. And we're gonna see a very interesting lesson in political economy in the next few months, as the federal government is being asked to help carry the load for the city of Chicago and other similarly situated challenged jurisdictions.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that just blew my mind, I didn't know before I had you and Sheila on, I didn't know that a lot of most of the states and cities had budget balance or balanced budget requirements, and then it blew my mind that borrowed money was considered revenue to them.
It's interesting when we raise this point, the defenders of the system, oh, that's not revenue, they say, and technically it's not revenue, but it is treated as such in the budgeting process. It's a resource. It's an inflow, and it's almost as if you view, and they put it in the inflow section of the report, with longer term consequences, and that's what's pushed off, kicked the can down the road, and led us to the situation where we are today.
Yeah, I was in Chicago in December, and the city was dead. It was pretty well. It was nice because I got to actually walk around without anybody there and go see things. But it was also pretty sad to see that. I mean, just all the different stores that were shut down, and that's a lot of tax revenue that is lost. And I think there's a lot of people fleeing major cities for more suburban or even rural environments. And so it's like the only option is either to cut spending dramatically, which politicians don't like to do, or borrow more money because they're not going to be able to raise taxes substantially to pay for it. So it seems like it's
or knock on Uncle Sam's door and ask for, and that's definitely the other option that's currently being pursued, both explicitly and behind closed doors. I think very implicitly, strongly, the demands for the bailout. What do you call the stimulus? Do you call it relief? Do you call it bailout? It depends on where you stand, but the, the relationship between the federal government and many state and local governments is financially going to be very interesting to watch this year.
Yeah, I just call it inflation. That's my definition for stimulus. It's
What was the line? I think it was Milton Friedman. Inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon. It's not necessarily fiscal. The Federal Reserve, in its infinite wisdom, will offset the inflationary if it does a good job of conducting monetary policy right. I mean, if it pursues stable prices, shouldn't it be able to offset the inflationary implications of government spending, ambitious government bailout plans?
I mean, I don't really think so because I think like we're walking on a tightrope, and the wind is picking up, and on one side is deflation and the system breaking, and on the other side is inflation and the system breaking. And so, like, I mean, from my understanding, I'm not an expert on the topic, but from my understanding, like the tool that they have are to let interest rates rise. And we know what happens when they do that is that, like, the markets become pretty unhappy, and like we were talking about earlier, the psychology can change really quick and drive these massive movements that are really destructive.
Well,
So
as
I
soon as you
think,
talk, which interest rates might you be referring to? We're exploring some very difficult waters here. If the Federal Reserve does sense that inflation is becoming a problem, and historically we've learned, for instance, in the 70s, that they tend to do so after it's already become a problem. They don't necessarily act proactively, they react to previous mistakes. If they do that again and start raising short-term rates, what will happen to the long end of the yield curve? That's going to be an important question. Can the Federal Reserve manage the long end as well as the short end? That's a matter of debate. Some people believe that it's gotten so much more active in general, and at the long end in particular, that long-term interest rates, and we can talk, given your concern about inflation statistics along these lines, the signal from tips may or may not be what it used to be if the Federal Reserve has more buying and selling of long-term instruments, including tips, Treasury inflation protected securities, in its monetary policy. It's possible we don't get as valid a read from market signals from long-term interest rates than we got previously. I'm losing my voice. I got to grab some Diet Coke that's empty.
yeah, no worries.
All right, no sweat. We'll dig it out here.
Yeah, the market is, I don't know. It would be nice to have a crystal ball. Why would anybody want to buy bonds right now?
I think Warren Buffett raised some questions about that in his latest annual shareholder letter. Did you see that his remarks? The
No.
bond investors are not looking at a good future, I think, was along the lines. I haven't looked closely at the context within what he said that, but having said that, I kind of would have said the same thing 4 years ago. So I've been wrong for 4 years. Maybe we're in a new normal that's very strange and different.
Yeah, the bond bull market may be ending. It's like I I haven't watched a Berkshire Hathaway meeting for a few years, because I've just gone down the Bitcoin rabbit hole so hard. Um, it it is definitely a lot of fun to watch Warren and Charlie Munger, talk about things. So maybe I should go back and I was definitely more interested recently in the GameStop hearing,
Okay.
which was a complete debacle in of itself.
Well, speaking of Warren and Charlie, I have a story that relates to one of those topics I brought up for you, and that's the history of cash accounting.
Hmm.
I think you might enjoy this story. Um, Back in the annual meeting for Berkshire Hathaway, in a previous life, I was actually covering them and went to their annual meeting the year after the 2008-2009 implosion. And in that big basketball court arena that they have Charlie and Warren sitting under one end of the basketball court and talking to like 10,000 people. And well, that Berkshire Hathaway meeting is really fascinating. It's a cultural phenomenon. But they expressed, and Warren talked about how the government really had to do that, had to do the stabilization or bailout or whatever you call it, but they had to step to the plate, and things were getting so bad it was getting into the money markets, and the commercial paper market was imploding. They had to stop it. They were run on money market mutual funds, and the government had to step to the plate. That was his argument. Well, the following day was the day that there's a media session. I wasn't in the media, but I was invited to this meeting, and there were like 30 reporters and other people there in order to ask questions. And they just take these questions from anybody, and it's cool to watch them react. They're amazing thinkers on the fly, and very, very smart, interesting people. But in order to choose which person asked the question, you had to put your hand into a hat and pull out a number. And so I put my hand into the hat and pull out number one. And I'm the first person to ask the question. So here I am 10 feet away from Warren and Charlie, and my knees are shaking. And I didn't blow it, Alex. I asked a really good question.
Nice.
And it relates to the accounting for cash. Going into the crisis, Berkshire Hathaway had roughly $40 billion in cash and cash equivalents at the top of its balance sheet for the different divisions. They had one of the most liquid and safe balance sheets on the planet, on the surface. But let's think about cash and cash equivalents very simply for a moment. What is cash, Alex?
It's a melting ice cube.
Well, I think you're going in the direction I might be going in. In accounting, cash and cash equivalents. Okay, we've got cash equivalents and we have cash. So what is cash? Cash in accounting is two main things: cash on hand, this stuff, and cash in a bank, in a deposit. Demand deposits, mainly, specifically. Are those equal things?
No.
What happened in 1907 in the United States? The panic of 1907. People were saying, thanks, but I don't want your stuff. I want my stuff. Give it to me now. The biggest banking panic ever in United States history, up until that point in time, happened because people didn't think those two things were equal. 2-3 years later, we got the solution: the Federal Reserve, the lender of last resort, in order to try to stabilize the system and make sure that those two things that weren't equal were equal. 20 years after that, what happened? The worst banking panic in US history. Despite the fact that we had the solution, or maybe because of the fact that we had the solution. Why am I bringing this up now? Cash is not equal to itself, but we add deposit insurance in order to try to make these two unequal things equal. And I'm afraid the moral hazard and other issues associated with these government stabilization schemes actually destabilize the system in the long run. We learned that in the S&L crisis. We didn't learn our lesson then. We learned it again in 2008, 2009. And that's why I asked my question of Warren. Here's my question that I asked at that annual meeting. Going into the crisis, you expressed appreciation and respect for the government's decision to stabilize the system. But going into the crisis, you had $40 billion in cash and cash equivalents on your balance sheet. Is it possible there were some moments in the crisis that were a little bit too exciting from your perspective? I mean, just think very simply. This wasn't the case, and in fact, the way they answered this question, you'll find interesting, I think. But what if that $40 billion was in one account at Citibank? How much of that is insured? Not much.
No. Yeah.
And so that money was at risk. So I was effectively asking if Berkshire Hathaway was an indirect bailout recipient of the governments. I didn't say that in my question, but Warren looked kind of mad at me, and so did and then they hit it out of the park. They were focused, and this is what Charlie said. He said, at Berkshire Hathaway, there's a few things that are beautiful in their simplicity, and this is one of them. We take no risk in our cash position. A lot of people at the time were stretching for yield, trying to maximize whatever possible yield they could get out of their cash, but they were in short-term government bond funds that were effective, maybe the safest thing you can possibly have. So they had cash and cash equivalents, and they really were cash-like. And that's why they were so stable. And in fact, Goldman Sachs had to buddy up to Warren during the crisis in order to try to get some investment along with the US government. A longer story. But why are we ranting and raving about this for your interest in alternative currencies? To what extent we owe our financial system to successive attempts by our government to shore up a fundamentally unstable state of affairs. A world without deposit insurance, without a central bank, is another possible future that could be in our future. But the accounting for money, when you ask simple questions, what is cash? What is money? You look under the hood on simple questions. That's when you learn about the important political and public policy issues associated with trying to ensure that money is a stable thing. And maybe those attempts to stabilize things make things unstable.
Yeah. Wow. You just blew my mind again. That's something I wouldn't really think about. I think the FDIC insurance is like up to, what is it, like $150,000?
I think it's 250 today, but I haven't
250.
looked in. But
So if
they
you
have
have,
all these magic mechanisms for helping people with big deposits break them up into lots of little bank deposits, and it all gets pretty interesting.
yeah, that makes even more sense to me now. Why companies like Tesla and MicroStrategy and Square and Mass Mutual are putting Bitcoin on their balance sheet right now, because it's something that you can self custody. And this is what I tell people a lot of times: is like, if it's in the bank, it's not really yours, and there's a lot of trust involved.
Well, that's now we got more history to learn from, I'm afraid, and that's the March 1933 episode. People thought they could self custody their gold until they couldn't, and
Yeah,
that's when go ahead.
yeah, that's an interesting discussion, and that's definitely one that's had a lot in the Bitcoin space. Is what if there's a potential confiscation? And I think like the difference between Bitcoin and gold in that regard is like a lot of the gold was being held in bank vaults, so it was very easy to custody, or easy to confiscate.
Confiscate.
Yeah. And so,
Mhm.
for this is a big thing in the Bitcoin space is the saying, not your keys, not your cheese, is like you need to be self-custodying it. If you leave it on an exchange, one, it's susceptible to hacking. It's not um, insured generally. And then two,
There's a similar issue with gold. Back in the day, people could quote self custody. They had backyards and basements, and they could try to do some of that too. But even then, the force of government, when it decides to do draconian things, is hard to reckon with. If they get serious and they start taking names and making it criminal for you not to turn in what you think is self custody, well, I hope we don't get to that day. But
yeah, it's entirely in the realm of possibility, because what a lot of people don't understand in the United States is what happens when a currency fails. Um, and capital controls come into play, and they start mandating what you can and can't do with your money, limiting ATM withdrawals. If you try to get out of the fiat currency for another, like this has happened in just about every country, Lebanon, Argentina, Egypt, every country that's experienced massive inflation. They force everybody into the local currency. and then they destroy it, and so your wealth just kind of evaporates. Um,
That
so
happened to a lot of people in 1933, 34. It was a sad element of our history.
yeah, but here's one of the nice things about Bitcoin. If you do get rounded up and thrown in prison for not um, exchanging it or allowing the confiscation of it, it'll probably be worth a lot more when you get out. It's less expensive. I say that jokingly, but um, it, it is very difficult to um, it's very difficult to try and trace in the same way that other things are, like using fiat currency. So, like, they banned Bitcoin in Nigeria, and yet Nigeria's adoption rates are higher than anywhere else in the world. Because people, and that's not like, a great comparison comparatively to the U.S. government, but you can transact and create circular economies of individuals that do not touch the exchanges where you have to give all your information over, and lose the anonymity and privacy, and um, be able to survive and transact. And that's just what happens when things go sour real fast, is black markets spring up because people need to survive. Like, people need to eat, and like when your choice is between starvation, eviction, or operating illegally, it's a pretty easy choice for most people. And it's really interesting looking at how that works. And if anything, like, the cool thing about Bitcoin too is you can flee. So like, say something like that happens, you can just leave the country with all your wealth in your pocket if you want to, or at least a large amount of it, which is very unique comparatively to gold. Like, going through customs with your Bitcoin is night and day difference than
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can put it on your laptop, you can put it on your phone, you can put it on a thumb drive or a hardware wallet, and versus like getting inspected by customs with your bars of gold that are easily confiscatable. So it's definitely not like foolproof. Like, I think, like, if something like that were to happen, a lot of people would be hurt. But it is a little bit more convenient, I guess, for self protection in a situation like that. So
Well, it's interesting to consider, in economics, we tend to presume that we like, freedom, we like free markets, we like outcomes with mutually advantageous, willing trading participants. And yet maybe the most fundamental market of all is our money market. And what have we done in the United States in our money markets? We've given 12 people the power to control short-term interest rates and try to manage all of our money and credit. Have we given up on economics for the most important market? Why? What's the maybe the time has come today for a conversation that we're getting more and more of about the fundamental wisdom. Maybe it's time for a new era. But I'm thinking out loud. I'm not speaking for truth in accounting. That's more of a
yeah, I like to think that money is like the base layer of society, and it has influence over just about every interaction that we have, and it needs to be one of the most important conversations that we're having. And it was something that baffled me in all my economics classes. Monetary theory was not a very important subject comparatively to, how do you manipulate prices with, different tools. Like, that was more.
in my money and banking class. I stress to the students, when if I sound cynical sometimes, at the end of the day, you've got to respect what good money does for society. When it works well, it's an amazing innovation. If I have cows and you have pigs and I don't want pigs, we can still do a deal. And it explodes the possibility of trade in a way that makes us all better off when it works well. And money itself and banks themselves aren't inherently bad things. They're doing wonderful things when the system works well. And
Yeah.
how does it work is, and whether or not government should be as involved as it is.
Yeah, I think that the idea of separating money and state is really a really interesting idea, and I think it's a really good idea.
How do
Um,
can you do it completely? Do you need to have property rights defined and protected? There has to be some role for government in creating standards? Where do you draw the line on separating money in the state? And standards include accounting policies.
yeah, yeah, that's a really interesting topic, and it's definitely been one that I've been exploring. Like, how can government have a positive relationship to Bitcoin? And it definitely is one that, like, we're so early on in the stage, and, like, a lot of people in the Bitcoin space, like myself, believe that it's going to be the dominant currency of the future, and that it's going to radically definancialize society, where and actually enable people to, like, instead of putting all this money into risk assets in their 401k accounts, they're going to be able to invest in themselves and hold equity in themselves, because they're going to be able to save. Um, but yeah, as far as, like, the role of government over money, I mean, I think there's, like, basic things that are really important that we protect, and that government has a positive role in protecting, which is private property, and individual rights. To have a court system to settle disputes in. But as far as, like, manipulating prices, I don't know if that's like subsidizing things, and coming up with things like minimum wages and stuff like that. I don't know if that's always beneficial. Now, um, I think it's a difficult conversation to have because we don't have a great definition of what government is, anymore, at least. You've got, um, it seems like the general conversation today is, like, demanding growth of government more and more so to be able to oversee just about every little thing. It's like, we're defining things like hate speech, and
Our government has grown dramatically, both explicitly and implicitly, the ways in which government outsources governmental function to private sector. The penumbra of government in the United States has gotten so large. It's pretty amazing.
yeah, I mean, that's one thing. I don't fit into the red versus blue battle, because I think those paradigms are not very helpful, and we're kind of moving in a direction where that isn't as relevant as it used to be. And the typical right wing response is that we need to privatize everything, but the way that that's been done is it just means that they're gonna offset all the accountability, by giving it to firms that are not transparent and open, in the same way.
Along
So,
along these lines, we got to recommend a cool book, uh, "Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists" by Raghu Rajan and Luigi Zingales at the University of Chicago. What their thesis is that capitalism inherently isn't necessarily bad, but what happens when capitalists end up controlling government and using government and government levers to make themselves better off, potentially at the worse off consumers and taxpayers. In this book, they cite one of my all-time favorite economists, this guy George Stigler at the University of Chicago, Stigler. Stigler was one of the founders of the idea of the capture theory of regulation. That the University of Chicago has a reputation for being this quote unquote pro-business, anti-government thing, but Stigler's thesis was really interesting along these lines that no, businesses don't necessarily dislike regulation. They like it because they control it and use it to their advantage at the expense of the average Joe and Jane and the taxpayer. And it's that perspective that we have to defend against. And in theory, our government is charged with promoting the general welfare. Well, what if it's being manipulated by special interest groups of any stripe, be they labor unions versus large corporate interests? And our government has been gamed to produce a system of captured advantage at the expense of the average general welfare, I'm afraid.
Yeah, it's really funny to watch these hedge funds demand regulation in response to the whole GameStop debacle. And I think that's a great point of like a lot of time, or like Amazon's the biggest advocate of a $15 minimum wage, because they're gonna benefit disproportionately from it. And I think minimum wage is a lot more nuanced conversation than um, is often presented to
Mm-hmm.
people. I think like where we're at right now, minimum wage discussion is just a response to inflation, of like wages are not following the increased cost of living, and people see that and they feel that and they're hurt by that. And so that's why it's being presented and lauded as a solution. But um, it's I mean, I think like the best thing a company could ever do is um, offer to pay employees at least partially in something like Bitcoin.
Well, you know who's thinking about that lately? Have you heard the stories? I think it's the city of Miami
Yep.
who's talking about contracting in Bitcoin, including with its own employees.
Hmm.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
I have a question for you regarding, we're getting kind of close to the end here, and learn in
Sure.
light of your interest on the monetary side, in this future possible world that you're talking about in 20, 30 years, from an accounting standpoint, we have statements like the balance sheet, the income statement, the long list of items, complicated, lots of words on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we have lots of numbers, but those numbers all have one thing in common. They're all denominated in dollars. The dollar is the unit of account. Well, what is a dollar? What will a dollar be in 20 years? Is it possible these statements are denominated in something else? Or, are we still going to have a legal, in the words of Edwin Vieira, he said that the dollar in our government's hands has changed from a specific amount of silver coin, which it was back in the founders' day, to a political abstraction. That's what he defined a dollar as, something that's malleable, that the government can change in its ability to pursue other goals. And so we can't trust a dollar, even though we do. And compared to the 70s, we're in better shape, I think, than we were back then from an inflation standpoint. But I hope I'm not wrong.
Yeah. I don't. It really is interesting to look at the future, because where Bitcoin stands, it's only 12 years old, and if we were to completely on ramp right now, I think it would be pretty difficult. Like the network could handle it, but the fees would go up through the roof, and it would be very difficult to really um, transact and effectively transfer money. So where we're at as far as from a scaling solution, we have something called the Lightning Network, and that is essentially like you create payment channels. It's a second layer built on top of the first settlement layer of Bitcoin. So like when I try and describe this to people, I like to say like cash is the base settlement layer of the dollar monetary system, and digital banking is like the second layer solution to help it scale and for transactions to happen quicker. And so that's kind of what the Lightning Network is, but it's only a couple of years old.
Uh-huh.
So it's kind of rough around the edges. I play around with it quite a bit, and I'm super excited about it because it's a lot nicer to get a transaction or pay a transaction fee that only is like couple fractions of a cent than it is to be at like a few dollars, because the fees are pretty high right now because of the price increase. So I'm explaining that because I think it's like, we're sitting in an era in regards to Bitcoin. We're sitting in a similar place to like the early development of the internet, of like, we had no idea the ways that it would disrupt technology and disrupt our lives today and become, like, I sit on the internet probably like 10 to 12 hours a day doing various things. We're doing conversations like this via Zoom. My school is on Zoom. My entire school is on internet. Um, and we're even, I would argue, in the early stages of the internet because of the developments that are coming around the bend with like virtual reality, and sorts of crazy things. Like, I have a friend that wears.
Speaking of crazy, have you heard of the Kurzweil? You've seen the prediction that we might be walking around with chips in our heads in 20 years. We might
Yeah,
be connected.
I think that's like entirely in the realm of the possibilities, because of I mean, that's essentially what our smartphones are, is like, it's an extension of ourselves, and of our consciousness. And people are very fearful of something like that, but I don't see how it's entirely different, because if they're worried about tracking and identification, it's like, well, if you have a smartphone,
You're
you're
being tracked.
you're being tracked everywhere, and they can listen to what you're saying, and it's, and even see what you're seeing. Like, I mean, hacking webcams is something the NSA has been known to do for a very long time. But so yeah, I mean, looking into the future, it would make sense to be able to account things in Bitcoin, because it is a superior money. It is a sound money that its monetary policy is not manipulatable in the same way. I mean, it's really superior. It's more portable, more divisible, more easily transported than any other currency, and you can settle it in a peer-to-peer manner, which is the first digital currency of its type, or ever, to do something like that. So I mean, I think,
Well,
like,
along those lines, we've had kind of the infancy of accounting standard setters' efforts to deal with cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin specifically in the last decade. But maybe that's just the beginning. It's gonna be important to watch how the accounting people, at the end of the day, money, what is it? It's got three elements. We talked about that in economics: a medium of exchange, a store of value. And I think the most fascinating is this: money is a unit of account. That's like the most,
mhm.
in my head, it's like the thing that makes money. What will money be in the future in terms of a unit of account in 20, 30 years? It's going to be amazing to watch.
Yeah, it's pretty mind blowing to think of where we could be just looking at the past 30 years and how things have shifted. Like, I, the world that I was born into is, it, compared to the world today, it's very different for sure. Um, yeah. Do you have any? How has, just like one final question? How have your opinions on Bitcoin changed over the past year?
I don't think they've changed a lot. I um, I respected it as an alternative a year ago. I'm still leery of the future in light of what government can or can't do to it. I'm afraid at the end of the day, the people with the tanks determine what money is, and that's a hard thing to overcome. If the government decides the market isn't going to be allowed to come to fruition, the government has an important role to play in making that future a reality. So I'm still concerned that the threat that it poses is one that the government won't sit idly by, and if that's the case, it may take longer to get to this future if it's a good future. Um, but I know it's going to be fun to watch, and I like competition, and I respect freedom and what people are trying to do with Bitcoin. So in a sense, I think I'm rooting for it still.
Yeah. I think one of the biggest things that Bitcoin has going for it is there's a lot of people in government that are Bitcoiners, and that will increase, especially as the price continues to go up and people are forced into the into owning it as a uh, inflation hedge slash just basic assurance policy. And I think like that's
The fact that places like the city of Miami are beginning to work
mhm,
with it. I mean, there's one way you can think about this negatively in the sense that, the cities, they're gambling in some place they shouldn't be. On the other hand, one thing that we've learned from history, and I'm going way back, not just 1776, but what things that are money, they become money because governments start accepting them as
mhm.
payment of taxes or in contracting services. And moneyness is determined by the willingness of government to work with it. So if places like Miami and other jurisdictions are actually doing that now, well, anyway, that's maybe the beginning of the growth curve. We'll see.
The dominoes are falling. Um, yeah. So where can people follow your work?
We're at www.truthinaccounting.org. That's our fundamental website with entree to all the different services that we provide. We also I do a daily newsletter covering government financial news on a daily basis called the Morning Call. As soon as you go to our website, you'll find a way to be invited to be on our daily newsletter. We've got about 800 to 1,100 people a day reading that newsletter. It's been a good growth vehicle for us and a way to build communication and relationships with folks. We also have a website called dataz.org, data-z, where we have about 700 different time series for economic, demographic, and government financial characteristics that I was just using this morning to compare the financial condition of states and cities to the home prices in the area, where you can see a pretty direct relationship. The recovery since the crash in 08, 09 is directly related to the government's financial condition. It's that kind of analysis you can do with that dataz website, that you can create your own charts and stuff like that. That's where people can get to know us.
It's awesome. Yeah, and I know you guys are doing some YouTube stuff too, which I was watching before. Um, Active on Twitter. I'll post out all the links in the description of the video.
Great.
Well, yeah, I really appreciate you coming on, Bill. This is a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's great to talk to you. I like thinking about this stuff in kind of fundamental, but sometimes radical ways. I think it's good to think out of the box like this.
Yeah.
That's how to be creative and maybe grow.
Yeah, I don't really know how to classify my conversations with Bill, if I should say that they're scary or fun. Either way, I enjoy them. But yeah, Truth in Accounting is a really important organization that unfortunately doesn't get as much attention as they deserve. I think part of it is because the establishment loves to prop themselves up with information and bad data that allows them to continue with the status quo. And we all know that we're getting screwed over, in various ways. And they do a really good job of explaining to at least some degree how we are getting screwed over. Go check out their pension database and see how unfunded your pension is. If you're living in Arizona, it's looking pretty scary. And some places are worse off than others, but in reality, we need to hold our elected officials accountable. If they're going to take our money, then they better be doing something good with it. And they're not right now. But yeah, it's looking pretty scary where we're heading. I think inflation is an inevitability, and it's a pretty safe assumption. If you print trillions of dollars in a short amount of time and expand the money supply by somewhere like 25% in a year, it is going to end in rising prices and essentially just the devaluation of your purchasing power. The money that you receive in your paycheck isn't going to be worth as much. And that's why tools like Bitcoin are so important right now. But yeah, if you want to learn more about Bitcoin, there's some great meetup groups in Tucson and Phoenix that you can check out. Check out the Arizona Bitcoin Network on meetup.com and check out the Tucson Bitcoin Meetup. we're doing a lot of great stuff with those different groups. You can come and learn, ask questions, doing presentations on different topics, on different tools that you can use. And if you want something specifically covered, you can ask, and hopefully we'll be able to answer those questions. But yeah, also feel free to reach out to me on Twitter, LinkedIn, and I guess I'm on Facebook too. I hate Facebook, but I'll answer your messages if you message me there at Tucson Bitcoin. But yeah, hope you have a good one. Thanks for watching or listening.